Welcome to the historian's tome. Today we're stepping into a moment in history when the world was burning on two fronts, one in Europe and one right here in Mexico. When the First World War erupted in 1914, most people picture trenches in France, artillery booming across Belgium, and empires collapsing under their own weight. But far from the European battlefield, another war was raging. A war just as fierce, just as chaotic, and one that would reshape an entire nation. So here's the question guiding our journey today. What was happening in Mexico while the rest of the world was fighting the Great War? The answer is dramatic. Mexico wasn't watching from the sidelines. It was fighting its own revolution, a massive, grinding conflict that tore the country apart and rebuilt it at the same time. Cities rose and fell. Leaders were overthrown, assassinated, or betrayed. Armies formed, split, and reformed under new banners. And while these internal battles raged, foreign powers watched closely, because what happened inside Mexico's borders could change the balance of global power. This revolution wasn't just a local struggle. It shaped politics, economics, and diplomacy across the hemisphere. It influenced decisions in Washington, London, and even Berlin. And as we'll see, it played a surprising role in bringing the United States closer to joining WDI. By the end of this episode, you'll see why Mexico's revolution is one of the most important, yet often overlooked, stories of the early 20th century. And if you enjoy deep dives like this, feel free to subscribe for more history stories from the historian's tome. Before the First World War crashed over Europe, Mexico was already living through its own storm. And that storm had been building for decades under the rule of one man, Porfirio Díaz. For more than 30 years, Díaz sat at the center of Mexican politics, shaping the country with a mix of strict control, careful alliances, and an iron belief that order came before everything else. When Díaz first took power in the late 1800s, Mexico was unstable. Rebellions, bankrupt governments, and constant leadership changes had worn the country down. Díaz promised stability, and for a while he delivered. Railroads were built. Cities grew. Foreign investors poured money into mines, factories, and oil fields. To many outsiders, it looked like Mexico was finally modernizing. But there was a cost, and it was paid by the people who had the least. Under Díaz, the economy grew, but the benefits went to a small circle of elites and foreign companies. Investors from the United States, Britain, and France gained control of mines, railways, and vast stretches of land. Entire regions were essentially run by foreign managers who answered only to their companies, not to Mexico's workers or communities. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary Mexicans were pushed to the edge. Farmers lost land as large estates, called haciendas, expanded. Some families who had owned land for generations were forced to leave and work as laborers on the same soil they once called their own. Wages were low. Debt peonage trapped workers in endless cycles of poverty. In many villages, people had no voice and no legal protection. Cities weren't much better. Factories grew, but working conditions were harsh. Strikes were met with violence. The government, loyal to Díaz, used police and soldiers to keep order, which often meant breaking unions and arresting activists. Political freedom nearly disappeared. Elections were rituals, not real contests. Díaz always won. Still, he argued that Mexico wasn't ready for full democracy, that progress required discipline. But as the years passed, the gap between rich and poor widened. Anger simmered in the countryside and in the mining camps. Even many of Díaz's old allies began to feel that his long rule had gone too far. By the early 1900s, that anger finally found a voice: Francisco Madero, a wealthy landowner who believed in democracy. Madero wasn't a radical. He wasn't a general. He wasn't even a natural politician. But he was brave, and he had a simple message that shook the entire system. Mexico should choose its leaders freely. Madero challenged Díaz, as in the 1910 presidential election. For the first time in decades, Mexicans felt the possibility of real change. People organized. They campaigned. Madero traveled the country, calling for political freedom and an end to Díaz's grip on power. Díaz reacted quickly. He jailed Madero and declared himself the winner, again. It was supposed to be routine, the same old pattern repeating itself. But this time, it wasn't. The country had changed. People refused to accept another stolen election. From the north to the south, armed groups began to rise. Some were small bands of farmers. Others were led by men who would become giants of the revolution. Pancho Villa in Chihuahua, Emiliano Zapata in Morelos. They didn't all fight for the same goals, but they all agreed on one thing: Díaz had to go. Madero escaped from jail and fled to the United States. From there, he issued a call to arms, urging Mexicans to revolt on November 20, 1910. That date is now marked as the beginning of the Mexican Revolution, a conflict that would stretch for years, reshape the nation, and pull it into the wider currents of world politics. Just as the First World War was about to erupt overseas, Díaz's long rule ended in 1911, but the struggle for Mexico's future had only just begun. The country was now in motion, and nothing would be the same. The revolution opened old wounds, exposed deep inequalities, and raised the question that still echoes today: was Díaz a stabilizer who modernized Mexico, or a dictator who held the nation back? The fall of Porfirio Díaz did not begin with a single battle or a dramatic explosion. It began with a man who refused to accept that the future had already been written for him. When Francisco Madero escaped from prison and crossed into the United States, he carried with him little more than determination and a belief that Mexico deserved a voice. But sometimes that's enough to change a nation. From exile, Madero issued the Plan of San Luis Potosi, his call to arms. He named November 20th, 1910 as the day Mexicans should rise. Many didn't wait for the date. Anger had already reached a boiling point. Farmers, miners, railway workers, and villagers had been pushed for too long. The plan wasn't just a political document. It was a match thrown into dry grass. And suddenly, flames spread everywhere. In the north, small bands formed in desert towns and mining camps. Some were veterans. Others were simply young men with nothing left to lose. But among them was a figure who would dominate the northern front: Pancho Villa. At the time, Villa wasn't the legendary commander he would later become. He was a man shaped by harsh landscapes, quick decisions, and a personal sense of justice. Villa didn't rise because of ideology. He rose because people believed he could fight and win. In the south, the movement looked very different. Here the land was green, fertile, and tightly controlled by wealthy haciendas. The people of Morelos had been losing their farms for years, watching sugar estates consume entire villages. Their champion was Emiliano Zapata, calm in manner, but relentless in purpose. Zapata's cry, Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty, cut to the heart of the region's suffering. For him, the revolution wasn't about elections. It was about restoring land to those who had worked it for generations. Villa and Zapata, never fought side by side in these early years, but their uprisings pressed Diaz from two directions. The North moved with speed and fury. The South moved with discipline and local unity. Madero's original call had transformed into a nationwide struggle far bigger than anything he expected. By early 1911, Diaz was losing control. Federal troops faced defeats in places they once dominated. Supply lines faltered. Promises of stability, Diaz's greatest selling point, were now impossible to believe. The old regime had survived challenges before, but this one felt different. It wasn't a single rebellion. It was the country itself rising, while battles raged. Madero crossed back into Mexico and tried to channel the chaos into a political victory. But he quickly discovered that revolutions don't follow tidy plans. He wanted reforms and elections. Villa wanted justice and opportunities for the people of the North. Zapata wanted immediate land redistribution. These differences didn't matter yet, but they would soon. The turning point came with the siege of Ciudad Juarez. Rebel forces surrounded the city, cutting off federal troops. Villa and another rising commander, Pascual Orozco, pushed the attack. Madero wanted to negotiate, but he couldn't stop the momentum. When the city fell, it shattered any illusion that Diaz could hold power. Within weeks, Diaz realized the truth: his rule was over. At age 80, he signed his resignation and prepared for exile. On May 31, 1911, he boarded a ship bound for Europe. For the first time in decades, Mexico stood without Diaz at its helm. As his ship left port, crowds gathered, not to mourn him, but to witness the end of an era. Some felt relief, others felt uncertainty, but all understood that the Mexico they knew had vanished. When Madero entered Mexico City as the hero of the revolution, the air was filled with hope. People believed they were stepping into a new age, one where democracy would finally take root. But the problems that fueled the revolution had not disappeared. Land remained in the hands of a few. Workers still struggled, and the rising figures of the revolution, Villa and Zapata, were not finished fighting. The storm that had started with Diaz's fall was far from over. In fact, the most violent chapters of the revolution were still waiting just beyond the horizon. When Francisco Madero entered Mexico City in 1911, crowds filled the streets with cheers, confetti, and hope. For the first time in living memory, a president had come to power not through force or manipulation, but because people demanded change. Madero promised democracy, and after decades under Diaz, that promise felt like a new sunrise. But revolutions don't end the moment a dictator falls. They only become more complicated. Madero believed deeply in peaceful reform. He wanted a Mexico where elections were fair, where the press could speak freely, and where disagreements were settled at the ballot box, not on the battlefield. His instinct was to calm the country, not to push it further into conflict. He released political prisoners. He tried to integrate rebel fighters into civilian life. He hoped that once Diaz was gone, unity would naturally return. It didn't. The reality Madero walked into was a country full of wounds. Entire regions had been torn apart by fighting. Power structures had collapsed, and the armed men who helped bring him to victory, men like Villa, Orozco, and Zapata, had their own visions for Mexico's future. Madero wanted gradual reform. They wanted immediate transformation. Pressure hit him from every direction. Conservatives who once supported Diaz watched Madero with suspicion. To them, he was too idealistic, too inexperienced, too trusting of the revolutionaries who had fought in the fields and mountains. Wealthy landowners feared losing their estates. Business leaders feared instability. The Catholic hierarchy feared anti-clerical reforms. These groups quietly worked to undermine him, waiting for the moment he would falter. But the louder pressure came from the other side, from those who believed Madero wasn't moving fast enough. Rebels had risked their lives to overthrow Diaz. Now they wanted the promises of the revolution fulfilled. No one voiced this disappointment more sharply than Emiliano Zapata. Zapata didn't care about speeches in the capital. He cared about land. In Morelos, villages had been devoured by sugar plantations long before the revolution began. People expected Madero to return that land quickly. When he hesitated, Zapata felt betrayed. Reform later wasn't good enough for communities that had waited generations for justice. Zapata broke with Madero and issued the Plan of Ayala, declaring the president unfit to lead the revolution he had started. To Madero, this was heartbreaking. He admired Zapata, but he feared that quick land seizures would plunge the country back into chaos. He believed laws and stability had to come first. What he didn't see clearly was that many Mexicans no longer trusted later. They had heard that word during decades of Diaz's rule. Then came the army. The generals who once served Diaz still held powerful positions, and many of them resented Madero's reforms. Some wanted order restored at any cost. Others simply felt Madero was too never to handle a country in turmoil. He tried to balance their influence by keeping them close, but he underestimated how little loyalty they felt toward him. In February 1913, the tension finally exploded. It began with a rebellion inside Mexico City, led by conservative generals who hoped to spark a quick coup. What followed became one of the darkest weeks in the revolution. The Decena Tragica, the 10 tragic days. The capital turned into a battlefield. Artillery shells tore through neighborhoods. Fires burned across the city. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. At first, Madero trusted his army to defend him. He believed that loyalty still meant something. But one of the generals he relied on most, Victoriano Huerta, was already negotiating behind his back. While Madero was trying to save the country, Huerta was plotting to take it. Within days, troops loyal to Huerta surrounded the presidential palace. Madero was arrested. The hope that had filled the streets 2 years earlier dissolved into fear and disbelief. On February 22, 1913, Francisco Madero and his vice president José María Pino Suárez were taken from their cells under the excuse of being moved. They were shot before they reached the prison gates. The men who murdered them claimed it was an escape attempt. No one believed that lie. Not then, not now. With Madero dead, Huerta seized the presidency. He presented himself as the man who would restore order. But instead of calm, his rise opened the door to one of the bloodiest periods of the revolution. And for Mexico, the hope that had arrived with Madero's victory was replaced by something else. Rage, betrayal, and the certainty that the revolution was far from over. Victoriano Huerta rose to power through betrayal, and from the moment he took control in 1913, his rule carried the weight of that crime. He presented himself as the man who would restore order to a broken country. In reality, he governed through force, intimidation, and a cold confidence that fear could succeed where reform had failed. Huerta dissolved Congress, censored the press, and filled government positions with loyal officers. He treated the revolution as something that could be crushed with enough soldiers and enough prisons. Cities that questioned him received troops instead of answers. Political opponents disappeared. Civilians were arrested for even minor criticism. Huerta believed that Mexico needed a strong hand, and he was ready to be that hand, no matter the cost. But the country did not respond the way he expected. Many Mexicans refused to accept him as president, not only because of his methods, but because his rise was built on the death of Madero, a leader who had inspired genuine hope. News of Madero's murder spread across Mexico, and the anger it created did not fade. Instead, it settled into a deep resentment. To Huerta's enemies, he was not a stabilizer. He was a usurper who had stolen the revolution's future. The growing resistance inside Mexico was only part of Huerta's problem. From the north, across the border, the United States watched everything closely. President Woodrow Wilson refused to recognize Huerta's government. Wilson believed that Huerta had come to power through treachery and would only throw Mexico deeper into conflict. For the United States, recognizing him would mean accepting a leader who had killed a democratically elected president. Wilson would not accept that. This refusal hardened Huerta's attitude. He believed Mexico should stand independent of foreign pressure, and he resented the idea that another country would judge his right to rule. Relations quickly deteriorated. Diplomats argued. Letters turned into threats. Both governments prepared for possible confrontation. While all this happened, the revolution inside Mexico reignited. Leaders like Venustiano Carranza, Pancho Villa, and Emiliano Zapata rallied their followers once again, this time to remove Huerta. The situation darkened further in April 1914, when a small incident in the port of Tampico set off an international crisis. American sailors had been arrested after entering a restricted area. They were released almost immediately, and local commanders apologized, but the United States demanded a formal, ceremonial apology from Huerta himself. Huerta refused. He claimed Mexico's dignity was more important than foreign demands. Wilson responded by ordering American forces to seize the port of Veracruz. The operation was meant to cut off weapons headed to Huerta, but it quickly turned into a full occupation. For many Mexicans, the sight of foreign troops landing in a major port stirred old memories of intervention and conquest. It did not matter whether they supported Huerta or fought against him. The presence of American soldiers on Mexican soil united people in anger. Anti-United States sentiment surged. Protests erupted across the country. Even revolutionaries who opposed Huerta condemned the occupation. Strangely, this crisis hurt Huerta far more than it helped him. Instead of rallying the country around his leadership, it exposed how weak he had become. His army was stretched thin, losing battles to the revolutionary forces. His political support was collapsing at home. His foreign support had disappeared completely. He tried to posture as a defender of Mexico's sovereignty, but by then, few believed he could defend anything. Revolutionary armies advanced from multiple directions. Carranza's constitutionalist movement gained momentum in the north. Zapata pushed through the south. Villa captured key cities and grew more powerful than ever. Every victory made Huerta's circle smaller and more desperate. One by one, his generals abandoned him. Supplies ran short. Ordinary citizens refused to cooperate with his forces. By mid-1914, Huerta realized he had no path forward. The occupation of Veracruz had cut off resources. The revolutionaries held more territory every week. Even members of his own government whispered about what life might look like after he fell. On July 15, 1914, Victoriano Huerta resigned and fled the country. His departure ended one of the briefest and most severe dictatorships in Mexican history. Yet Mexico did not find peace in his absence. The fall of Huerta opened a new chapter filled with internal rivalries and shifting alliances. The revolution kept moving, pulled forward by leaders who had fought for different visions of the country's future. And the struggles that followed would shape not only Mexico, but its role in the world at the very moment Europe plunged into war. If you are enjoying the story so far, consider sharing the video to support the historian's Tome. Huerta's fall did not happen by chance. It came from pressure building across the country, pressure that needed a leader who could pull many different groups together. That leader was Venustiano Carranza. As we step into this chapter, the revolution shifts again, the battlefield changes, old allies come together, only to collide later with even more force. Carranza called his movement the Constitutionalist Army. The name reflected his goal. He wanted to restore the rule of law that Huerta had shattered. But Carranza also understood something deeper. Mexicans were tired of the endless power grabs. They wanted a government that respected elections and basic rights. He promised to move the country in that direction, and many listened. For a brief moment, something rare happened. Leaders who had fought separate battles found a common purpose. Pancho Villa joined Carranza at first, seeing a chance to push for reforms in the north. Álvaro Obregón, another rising figure, brought discipline and organization to the movement. Obregón had a talent for strategy that few in Mexico could match. His leadership helped turn the Constitutionalist Army into a force that could challenge Huerta on every front. This coalition marched through key regions and gathered new supporters. Huerta faced pressure from foreign governments, from rebels across Mexico, and from a collapsing economy. Each loss weakened him. Each victory strengthened the constitutionalist cause. The country could sense that his grip was slipping. Even those who once supported him began to look for a way out. In July 1914, Huerta stepped down and fled the country. His fall brought a moment of relief. Many hoped that the revolution would finally deliver stability. The leaders who had fought together looked like they might guide Mexico toward a peaceful future. But the unity that defeated Huerta was fragile. It rested on shared hatred of a dictator, not on shared visions of Mexico's future. Once Huerta was gone, those differences surfaced with full force. Villa and Carranza had never fully trusted each other. Their goals were not the same. Carranza wanted a strong central government that could rebuild the nation. Villa cared more about helping the poor, rewarding his fighters, and reshaping northern society. They both believed they were fighting for Mexico, but they disagreed on what Mexico should become. Obregón stood close to Carranza. He believed Carranza offered the clearest path to rebuilding the state. Zapata, however, rejected Carranza almost immediately. Zapata's followers in the south had fought for land reform from the beginning. They felt Carranza moved too slowly and cared too much about political power. Zapata wanted land returned to the people right away, not after endless political debates. The revolution fractured again. Former allies turned into bitter rivals. Villa controlled large territories in the north and still commanded fierce loyalty. Zapata held the south with determination and refused to compromise. Carranza claimed he was the legitimate leader and pressed forward to establish a new government. Mexico plunged into another civil war. Cities that had barely recovered from earlier battles were pulled back into conflict. Trains carried troops instead of food. Families fled from one region to another, trying to escape the shifting lines of control. Victory on the battlefield no longer meant the end of fighting. It only meant the beginning of another struggle with a different enemy. As the Constitutionalist Army and Villa's forces clashed, Obregon proved himself once again. His ability to modernize tactics gave him an edge. Villa's courage and mobility were legendary, but he faced a new kind of warfare. Obregon used trenches, barbed wire, and coordinated attacks that worn down Villa's strengths. It became clear that this new civil war would reshape the revolution even more than the fight against Huerta had done. The fall of Huerta had opened the door to hope, but the revolution was not finished. It still needed to settle a deeper question. Who would define the future of Mexico? Carranza, Villa, or Zapata? Each leader believed their vision was the true path forward. The answer would unfold in the battles to come, setting the stage for the next and most decisive phase of the revolution. As Mexico's revolution tore the country apart, the rest of the world slipped into its own catastrophe. When World War I began in 1914, Europe entered a struggle that would scar an entire generation. Mexico watched from afar, but it did not stand in peace. It faced its own war, fought on its own soil, with its own questions about power, identity, and survival. While European armies dug trenches, Mexican towns lived under shifting control, never knowing who would arrive the next morning. The country was divided. Carranza claimed authority. Villa and Zapata pushed their own visions. Regional leaders held their own ground. The world's greatest powers were locked in battle overseas, yet Mexico was fighting a war that felt just as consuming. Foreign governments understood that Mexico mattered. They watched closely. Mexico sat between two oceans and shared a long border with the United States. It also held valuable oil reserves that fueled ships, factories, and armies. Britain, Germany, and especially the United States knew that whoever influenced Mexico would gain an advantage in the global struggle. As a result, these foreign powers tried to shape events without getting dragged too deep into the revolution's chaos. Germany saw an opportunity. If Mexico stayed unstable, the United States might stay too distracted to join the war in Europe. German agents monitored events and hoped that rival Mexican factions would keep the country divided. Britain, on the other hand, worked to protect its oil interests along the Gulf Coast. The United States had the strongest hand. It had already intervened in Veracruz earlier in the revolution, and it still watched the border carefully. To all of these nations, Mexico was not just another country. It was a key piece of a much larger puzzle. In 1916, one event pushed tensions even higher. Pancho Villa, once a revolutionary hero with strong ties to the north, led a raid across the border into the town of Columbus, New Mexico. Several Americans were killed. Homes and businesses were burned. Villa hoped the raid would draw the United States into conflict with Carranza. He wanted to weaken Carranza's position and revive his own. The attack shocked the American public. It was the first foreign raid on American soil in decades. President Woodrow Wilson responded by sending a military expedition deep into northern Mexico. General John Pershing led thousands of soldiers in pursuit of Villa. They marched through deserts and mountains, but Villa knew the land better than anyone. He avoided capture again and again. This created a tense situation. Two armies now operated in Mexico, both heavily armed and both suspicious of each other. A single mistake could have triggered a full war between Mexico and the United States. Somehow, neither side allowed that to happen. After months of searching, Pershing withdrew. Villa lived to fight another day, but the raid changed the way the United States viewed the revolution. The most dramatic moment came the next year. In 1917, British intelligence intercepted a secret message from Germany to Mexico. It became known as the Zimmermann telegram. In it, Germany asked Mexico to join them if the United States entered the war. They promised money and support. Most shocking of all, they encouraged Mexico to reclaim land it had lost to the United States, including Texas and Arizona. When the telegram became public, the world reacted instantly. For many Americans, it felt like a threat too serious to ignore. Mexico, however, had no interest in joining the European war. Carranza studied the message and dismissed it. Mexico was too divided, too exhausted, and too focused on its own future to fight the United States. The government quietly refused the offer, but the damage was already done. The telegram helped push the United States closer to declaring war on Germany. So while Europe fought with gas, trenches, and artillery, Mexico fought a different kind of war. It fought for stability, for land, for political legitimacy. The revolution shaped how foreign powers treated Mexico during World War I, and Mexico's choices influenced the balance of global politics. Both conflicts unfolded at the same time, each with its own stakes, each reshaping the world in its own way. After years of war, betrayal, and shifting alliances, Venustiano Carranza finally began to consolidate power. With Huerta gone and his rivals weakened, Carranza emerged as the leader most capable of bringing some order to Mexico. His rise was not sudden but steady, built on strategy, alliances, and the support of key generals like Álvaro Obregón. Carranza understood that military victories alone would not secure his position. He needed legitimacy. And in a country exhausted by constant fighting, legitimacy came from recognition, both at home and abroad. The United States played a significant role in Carranza's ascent. President Woodrow Wilson had refused to acknowledge Huerta, and while he remained cautious about intervening directly in Mexican politics, he saw Carranza as the lesser of many evils. For Washington, backing Carranza meant stabilizing a neighbor without risking further escalation. This support strengthened Carranza's position, giving him credibility that few other revolutionary leaders enjoyed. At the same time, it created resentment among rivals like Pancho Villa, who saw U.S. backing as a threat to Mexican independence and a challenge to their own ambitions. Carranza's first challenge was turning military success into political authority. Winning battles was one thing, but building a government that could endure was another. He knew that Mexico needed more than a strong man in charge. It needed rules that would guide the country beyond the next skirmish. This realization led him to take a bold step. In 1917, Carranza called for a new constitution. The Constitution of 1917 was not just a document. It was a promise to shape Mexico in ways that the revolution had long demanded. The new constitution addressed the grievances that had fueled the revolution for years. It promised land reform, giving communities and farmers the right to reclaim or receive land that had been concentrated in the hands of a few. It recognized the rights of workers, including the right to organize and strike. It limited the power of the Catholic Church, reflecting the revolutionaries' desire to ensure the state held authority over national affairs. Education and labor laws were also included, laying the foundation for a modern nation. The Constitution was ambitious, progressive, and meant to address centuries of inequality and injustice. But writing laws on paper was easier than enforcing them on the ground. Carranza's government faced resistance from those who had fought for different visions of Mexico. Zapata and his followers refused to recognize the new order. In the South, they continued their struggle for immediate land redistribution, unwilling to wait for bureaucratic processes. In the North, Pancho Villa also resisted. His forces controlled key territories, and although he had fought alongside Carranza at times, he distrusted the new government. Villa's focus remained on empowering the people of Chihuahua and ensuring rewards for his supporters. Violence persisted despite the Constitution's promises. Trains still carried soldiers instead of goods. Towns and villages were caught between rival factions. Carranza's authority was real but fragile. He could claim the capital and control the bureaucracy, but the countryside remained contested. Every attempt to impose laws met the challenge of long-standing loyalties and deep-seated grievances. For ordinary Mexicans, the revolution was far from over. Land, security, and justice were still uncertain. Even so, the Constitution represented hope. It was the first time that revolutionary ideals were translated into a legal framework that could endure beyond any single leader. For historians and citizens alike, it marked a turning point. Carranza's government, despite its limitations and the ongoing unrest, had created a structure that would influence Mexican politics and society for decades. At the same time, the contradictions of the period were clear. A new legal order existed on paper, but the reality on the ground was different. Carranza's victory brought him recognition and international legitimacy, but the revolutionaries who had risked everything were not entirely satisfied. Zapata's vision of immediate land reform and Villa's insistence on local empowerment clashed with Carranza's emphasis on centralized authority. The country remained divided, and the struggle for justice and equality continued even under a government that claimed to represent the people. The Constitution of 1917 was a foundation, not a conclusion. It set the rules, outlined rights, and promised a future shaped by law rather than by guns alone. Yet it also reminded everyone that change required more than words. It required enforcement, negotiation, and the slow work of reconciliation in a country still healing from decades of conflict. The legacy of Carranza's government and the new constitution would be felt long after the battles ended. It provided a framework for social reform, guided political development, and became a reference point for generations of Mexicans seeking justice and equality. At the same time, the ongoing resistance of figures like Zapata and Villa showed that revolution is never a single act. It is a process, messy and ongoing, shaped by ideals, ambition, and the stubborn determination of those unwilling to settle for less than their vision of a just society. What part of the Constitution do you think had the biggest impact? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Even as Carranza's government tried to establish stability, the revolution was far from over. Deep in the South, Emiliano Zapata and his followers continued to fight for the land reforms they had demanded for years. Zapata had become a symbol of resistance, a living reminder that the promises of the revolution could not be fully trusted until they were realized on the ground. His army, though smaller and more localized than the forces of Villa or Carranza, inspired fierce loyalty. For the people of Morelos, Zapata was not just a leader, he was justice in motion. But even heroes are vulnerable. In 1919, Zapata was lured into a trap. Betrayed by those who pretended to negotiate, he was ambushed and killed. The news spread quickly, shocking supporters and demoralizing his followers. His death did not immediately end the struggle in the South, but it did remove the figurehead who had given the movement its energy and moral authority. Without Zapata at the helm, the momentum of his forces waned, and the Southern fight for land reform became fragmented. His ideals lived on, but the movement that had surged under his command was never quite the same. While the South mourned, Carranza faced growing discontent in the north and central regions. He had tried to control the succession of power, insisting that his preferred candidate should inherit the presidency. Many saw this as a betrayal of the revolution's ideals. Soldiers and politicians alike, tired of being dictated to, began plotting against him. The country that had endured years of chaos suddenly found itself on the brink of another upheaval. Rebellion spread quickly, fueled by old rivalries and renewed ambition. Carranza, who had once seemed untouchable, suddenly had few allies left. In 1920, as forces loyal to Álvaro Obregón and other regional leaders closed in, Carranza realized that he could no longer command the loyalty or fear that had kept him in power. He attempted to flee the capital and reach a safer haven, but his plans failed. Along the way, he was intercepted and killed, bringing a violent end to the leader who had tried to navigate Mexico through the final stages of the revolution. His death marked the end of an era of central authority, struggling to assert itself, and it opened the door for a new phase of leadership. Into this void stepped Álvaro Obregón, a general who had demonstrated remarkable skill throughout the revolution. Obregón had fought under Carranza, but he was not bound to the old politics. He understood that Mexico needed more than military strength. It needed organization, compromise, and a clear plan for governance. Taking power, Obregón focused on restoring order and reconciling the factions that had fought for so long. He worked to integrate former rebel groups into a single national army, provided amnesty where possible, and implemented policies aimed at stabilizing the economy and society. Under Obregón, Mexico began to breathe again. Cities and towns that had been torn apart by fighting slowly recovered. Schools reopened, trade resumed, and local governments regained some measure of authority. While tensions and occasional skirmishes persisted, the broad cycle of revolutionary violence began to ease. For the first time in more than a decade, people could imagine a future not defined by constant upheaval. The revolution did not end with Obregón, but it entered its final phase. Its battles had transformed Mexico, reshaping society, politics, and culture in ways that were impossible to ignore. Land reforms had begun, though unevenly. Worker rights were gaining recognition. Symbols, heroes, and stories of struggle became woven into the national identity. The violence, betrayals, and shifting alliances of the previous 10 years had left scars, but they had also set the stage for a modern Mexico emerging from the chaos of revolution. In many ways, the deaths of Zapata and Carranza signaled the end of one era and the beginning of another. Zapata's ideals endured in the hearts of those who had fought alongside him, while Carranza's vision of centralized authority faded into history. Obregón's leadership brought a fragile peace, showing that even after years of relentless struggle, Mexico could move towards stability. The revolution had not achieved every dream, but it had changed the country permanently, leaving behind lessons, reforms, and stories that would be remembered for generations. As the dust settled, it became clear that the Mexican Revolution was more than a series of battles. It was a transformation, a time when ordinary people and extraordinary leaders alike challenged the old order, questioned authority, and demanded a new vision for their nation. The revolution had taken its toll, but it had also created the framework for the Mexico that would continue to evolve throughout the 20th century. By the early 1920s, Mexico had finally begun to emerge from more than a decade of upheaval. The fighting had ended, leaders had fallen, and the smoke of battle had cleared from the countryside. What remained was a country transformed. The Mexican Revolution had been a story of struggle, sacrifice, and change, and its legacy would shape the nation for generations to come. One of the most visible impacts of the revolution was social change. Land reform, which had been a central demand of rebels like Emiliano Zapata, began to take hold. Haciendas were broken up, and some land was returned to communities and small farmers who had once been driven from it. This process was neither immediate nor complete, but it marked a dramatic shift in the balance of power in rural Mexico. For the first time, ordinary Mexicans could envision owning and working land that was truly theirs. Worker rights also improved. Factories, mines, and other workplaces slowly began to recognize the demands of laborers. The new constitution provided the legal framework to support unions, strikes, and protections against exploitation. While challenges remained and conflicts continued, these changes gave workers a voice they had never had before. Education expanded as well, particularly in rural areas. Schools spread into villages that had long been neglected, offering opportunities to a generation that had previously been denied access to learning. These reforms laid the foundation for a society where citizens could participate more fully in public life, making the revolution about more than just politics or military victories. The revolution also reshaped national identity. Mexico now had heroes whose names would endure in history. Zapata, Villa, Madero, and even Obregón became symbols of courage, determination, and the fight for justice. Murals, songs, and literature celebrated their deeds and sacrifices. Towns and cities adopted new symbols and commemorations, and revolutionary ideals began to define what it meant to be Mexican. The struggle for equality, dignity, and self-determination became part of the country's collective memory, and the revolution itself became a cornerstone of national pride. The impact of the Mexican Revolution was not confined to Mexico's borders. During the same period, the world was engulfed in the First World War, and Mexico's ability to maintain its independence drew attention from major powers. Despite internal chaos, the country resisted foreign pressure, refused to be drawn into the European conflict, and made its own choices about alliances and national security. The Zimmerman telegram episode had shown that even distant powers considered Mexico strategically important, and yet the nation navigated these pressures without losing control of its destiny. Beyond immediate diplomacy, Mexico's revolution sent a broader message. Around the world, movements for social justice, land reform, and worker rights watched closely. The Mexican Revolution became an example of how ordinary citizens and determined leaders could challenge entrenched systems of power and force change. It inspired future generations to consider the possibility of reshaping society through struggle and political action. In many ways, the revolution became both a national and international symbol of resistance and reform. Yet the legacy was complex. While laws and reforms were put into place, Not every promise was fulfilled immediately. Land reform took decades to fully implement. Economic inequality persisted in some areas. Regional differences and political tensions did not vanish overnight. But even with these challenges, the revolution had established a direction. It had shown that change was possible, that the people could assert their rights, and that Mexico would no longer be a country where a single leader or a foreign power could dictate the nation's future. The revolution also left a cultural legacy that endures to this day. Art, literature, music, and public memory all carried the story forward. Murals depicted battles, leaders, and the struggles of ordinary citizens. Songs commemorated victories and losses alike. These stories helped forge a shared understanding of Mexico's past and a sense of continuity for the future. The nation remembered the revolution not just as a series of events, but as a collective experience that had redefined the relationship between the people and their government. Ultimately, the Mexican Revolution reshaped the country politically, socially, and culturally. It laid the groundwork for modern Mexico by addressing inequalities, empowering citizens, and embedding the ideals of justice and reform into the national identity. It demonstrated that a society could endure violence and upheaval and still emerge with a stronger sense of self. For Mexico, the revolution was not just a chapter in history. It was a turning point that defined the character and aspirations of the nation for the century to come. Mexico's story during the early 20th century is one of struggle, resilience, and transformation. While the world was consumed by the First World War, Mexico fought its own revolution, a conflict just as fierce and chaotic. Cities and towns changed hands, leaders rose and fell, and ordinary people were caught in a whirlwind of violence and uncertainty. Yet through all the turmoil, the nation was being reshaped from the ground up. The Constitution of 1917 became the most enduring legacy of this revolution. It promised land reform, workers' rights, and expanded education, laying the foundation for a society where ordinary Mexicans could claim a voice in their government. Figures like Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa became symbols of courage and justice, their stories embedded in Mexico's national identity. The revolution showed that change required sacrifice, vision, and determination, and that the fight for equality and dignity could leave a lasting mark. Even as foreign powers watched closely, Mexico maintained its independence, navigating international pressures without losing control of its future. The revolution was not only a national story, but one that resonated globally, inspiring movements for justice and reform around the world. By the 1920s, the fighting had slowed, but the changes endured. Mexico had been tested by violence, betrayal, and uncertainty, yet it emerged with a clearer sense of its identity, its values, and its path forward. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Mexico's revolution. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to the Historian's Tome. Share your thoughts or questions in the comments, and let us know which historical story you want to explore next.